Week 6 of the college baseball rankings. Let's get into it. This week, especially, the back end of the rankings were very difficult to figure out. It's seeming like only really 21 teams or maybe 22 really wanted to be ranked. A lot of the teams after that just lost a bunch of games and seemed like there wasn't really a spot for them, but no teams right outside the rankings really stepped up and showed that they have something to prove there and jump in. So it's a tough one at the back end, but we can start at the top. Staying with LSU for me, I'm assuming it's going to be the same for you. They went 3-1 this week, beating at the time number 3 Arkansas over the weekend, and they just looked absolutely dominant in the wins. And the only loss this week was in extras, even though it looked like it happened to be a blowout, but it definitely was not.
Yeah, I mean, you just can't move them anywhere except in the one spot, keeping them there, winning a series over a very handedly top 10 team and top 5 in a lot of polls coming into this week. And yeah, LSU just continues to dominate throughout this season so far.
Yep, similarly, the number 2 spot sticking with Wake Forest, 22-3 overall. They went 4-0 this past week and only gave up 2 runs during the entire week. So while this year they've been kind of led by their offense, the pitching looked pretty good as well and continues to dominate lesser teams. And even this week they faced Miami and swept them. So that was a team that just came back into the rankings and might be dipping right back out.
Yeah, Wake Forest just continues to dominate as well. I mean, coming into the year, we knew Rhett Lauder was going to be one of the best pitchers in the country, but it looks like this staff overall is shaping out very well, and they're just continuing to dominate on the pitching side of things as well on the offensive end. And this was a pretty loud sweep over a good Miami team.
Yeah, definitely. And right after that, we had Arkansas in that 3 spot last week. Obviously, they might shift down a bit. For me personally, I had Vanderbilt moving up 1 spot after they just absolutely crushed Mississippi State over the weekend. And yeah, their offense just looked amazing. And that's something that people were potentially a bit skeptical of before the season started. Their offense was a little bit young, but obviously they're always going to have the talent there. It's just how they match up against SEC competition, and so far they've passed that test.
Yeah, Vanderbilt was looking a bit shaky to start off this season, but they are red hot right now and certainly look like one of the best teams in the SEC, one of the best teams in the country, and they absolutely dominated this past weekend against Mississippi State. I also had them in my 3 spot here, and a team that I think is similarly as hot as that team, Florida, is who I had slotted in my 4 spot right behind them.
Yep, I agree with that. Went 4-0 this past week. They beat Florida State at Florida State and then swept Ole Miss on the road. And yeah, Ole Miss at that time was number 11, which they won't be. They definitely won't be that high anymore after being 0-6 in conference so far. It's not the best look for them, but like we've seen before, they can definitely turn it around. As last year is kind of the note for that. Yeah. So similarly, we have LSU, Wake Forest, Vanderbilt, Florida, 1 through 4. After that, I think there are a few teams that can kind of be up for contention for the next spot. Me personally, I had Virginia jumping up from where we had them at 8 last week after they went 4-0 this past week, 22-2 overall. And they just keep getting decent wins now that they're facing better competition in their conference with sweeping Florida State this past week. And after the Friday game, the offense just looked absolutely amazing and got back on track to where they usually are, and they just absolutely dominated the other 2 games there. And Virginia is finally showing that they can match up against good competition as well as bad teams.
Yeah, this is besides the end of the rankings, this is one spot where I struggled a bit. For me, I had Arkansas here, followed up by Louisville, just because both teams went 2-2 on the week, so I struggled to drop them very far. But I did have Virginia in that 7 spot, following it up, and I don't really have an issue at all moving Virginia ahead of those 2. Virginia started off this year red hot, and like you mentioned, we were waiting for them to play tough competition to see if it was legit, and they are dominating throughout the start of this ACC play, so they're really solidifying themselves as one of the best teams in the country. So I am fine putting them up in this 5 spot.
Sweet. Yeah, I had Arkansas at 6 and then Louisville at 8, so we can kind of talk about those teams. But yeah, like you mentioned, they both went 2-2. I think Arkansas's 2-2 is obviously a little bit better than Louisville's after Louisville lost their weekend series at Notre Dame, which Notre Dame is definitely having more of a down year than we've seen previously. But yeah, I mean, it's still on the road, so you can't really discredit it too much. But I think there could be a few spots that they can drop from that more than what we saw with Arkansas. So we can put Arkansas in 6, and then I think there's potentially a little bit of a debate for that 7 spot there. I personally had Stanford there just because we had them in the 7 spot last week, and I don't think there's any reason to move them out of there since they went 3-0 versus Utah. Not much to say there, but Utah probably one of the worst teams in the conference, and Stanford took care of business.
Yeah, I think I'm fine with putting Stanford here. I would have had Louisville, but I think it was more of just so a judgment call for me, whereas Stanford hasn't thoroughly impressed me up to this point in this season so far. Not that Louisville necessarily has, but they were playing very well leading up to this weekend, and it was a series loss on the road, like we said. It is tough to win on the road, but I think you can go either way here.
Yeah, I think it's. I just want to like keep Stanford in the same spot. I don't think there's any reason to drop them. While Louisville, I mean, they'd only be dropping like 3 spots from going 2-2, which I don't think is too ridiculous. But yeah, personally, just would rather leave Stanford in that same spot.
Yeah, I'm good with that.
So after Louisville at 8, we can get into some SEC territory. I had Tennessee jumping up 1 spot from last week, kind of rebounding from their terrible week. They're now 19-6 overall, went 4-0 on the week, and swept Texas A&M, who was the number 15 last week, but is going to be dropping pretty significantly from there. But yeah, just great bounce back for them, and they were able to win some close games, and yeah, it looked like they had something to prove there.
Yeah, loud series win from them after getting swept the previous weekend. They needed this. A series win would have been good, but it felt like they needed a sweep here, even though it was against tough competition. And it feels like they're headed back in the right direction. And yeah, I mean, they're still one of the most talented teams in the country. I don't think anyone really questions that. And we don't think they're clicking at their full potential yet.
Yep, definitely. And then rounding out the top 10 for me, I had a pretty big jump from South Carolina, who was 14 last week, but they went 3-1 overall. They lost their midweek, which was a bit unfortunate at Charlotte, but then they swept what was number 19 Missouri on the weekend. So they are consistently proving that they can beat SEC teams now, which was like the one thing that was making their resume look really weak was just the competition they faced. They're 23-2 overall, so that kind of stands on its own, but now they're finally getting good wins, and yeah, great weekend sweep. Yeah, with winning some close games, but if this continues, then they definitely deserve to keep jumping up the rankings pretty quickly just because their record is so good.
Yeah, I also had them in this spot here. I think this is a team similar to Virginia that was just dominating throughout the start of the year, but we were unsure about because they hadn't played any tough competition. But as they win these SEC series, like you said, there's just more and more room for them to move up as they continue to solidify themselves as top contenders.
Sweet. So rounding out the top 10 with a few SEC teams. Then in the 11 spot, I dropped UCLA there. They were in the 9 hole last week, but they went 1-2 versus Washington at home, which is a tough home series loss where like looks like if a few things happened differently, they could have swept University of Washington, but both the close games they ended up losing, so they only got 1 win from the weekend, which is unfortunate, but you got to win those close games if you want to prove to be a top team in the country, and they just fell a little short of that, but it seems like Washington is pretty decent. They could potentially be ranked this week or in the few weeks coming if they continue to play well. But yeah, it's a tough loss for UCLA, so dropped them a few spots. They could definitely go further down depending on what you think about it.
Yeah, I went back and forth here on whether I wanted UCLA or East Carolina in this 11 spot, but I also went with UCLA. Tough series loss, like you said, but not a bad series loss. And a lot of teams in this 10 through 15 area were kind of moving elsewhere. And so I feel like this was a fitting spot to slot UCLA in.
Yeah, it's a great week for UCLA to lose a series with so many other teams around this area just having awful weeks. But yeah, I definitely was considering looking at East Carolina versus UCLA and just their overall resume. I thought UCLA's was just a bit better, even though this week they were a bit down and East Carolina had a little bit better of a week. Just UCLA came a little bit out on top, especially with East Carolina losing their midweek against the like one good team they faced, which was Campbell. So a ranked team, so definitely a tough competition there. But if they won that game, I think they probably could have jumped up into that 11 spot. But it's tough when you're sweeping a bad team on the weekend and just facing tough competition midweek, and you want to get those wins whenever they come around.
Agreed.
And then in the 13th spot, it felt weird to do this, but I had UNC jumping up 3 spots. They had a good week, but nothing phenomenal. They went 3-1 versus Duke on the weekend, won 2 games there. So good week, but just so many teams around this area dropped completely down in the rankings. So it's just like it feels like UNC got lucky in this scenario to be able to rise this much this week.
Yeah, I also had UNC jumping into this spot and had them followed up by Oklahoma State, who was right behind them the previous week as well. Neither one of these teams really had super impressive series wins, but they took care of business and teams in front of them were falling. So, like you mentioned, it didn't seem like they really deserved a big jump, but they just kind of fit in at these spots here.
Yeah, and similarly, I also had Boston College following up in the 15 spot, the exact same thing. They did pretty well. They beat NC State, who was ranked a few weeks ago, but yeah, it was good wins against decent teams. But it just doesn't seem like they should be rising this much. But there just were open spots everywhere, so all these teams just filled them in pretty easily.
Yeah, yep. Also had Boston College here. NC State's had a tough start to ACC play. They've faced tough competition, but they haven't played exceptionally well up to this point. So it's a team that needs to start playing better if they want to get back into the rankings. But regardless, it was a solid series win for Boston College.
After Boston College at 15, I had Campbell jumping from 21. I think they had a really good week. Overall, they're 19-3. They went 4-0 and beat East Carolina in their midweek, which we mentioned earlier, which helps because they don't get that opportunity to face good competition week in week out, and when you see you're going up against another ranked team, you really want to take advantage of that situation, and they did that. So even though most other weeks they probably wouldn't jump this much, it definitely warranted that they get the recognition there.
Yeah, I also had Campbell in this spot. I do think that midweek win over East Carolina is big. They are now 2-0 against them on the year, so they're winning this series of midweeks against them. And yeah, when you're a mid-major like that, it's really important to take care of those tough competition games in the midweeks, and they're doing that up to this point.
Definitely. Then after that at 17, I had Kentucky jumping up. They're 21-3 overall, which is a great record. They just hadn't really faced many teams before SEC play, but now through 2 weeks, their record looks really good still, and they beat Alabama at Alabama this past week, who is a team that's been on the fringe of being ranked, if not ranked, for the past few weeks. So yeah, definitely a good series win. They went 3-1 overall in the week, and definitely further prove that they deserve to be ranked, while Alabama's just on the outside looking in right now.
Yep. I also had Kentucky in this spot. Solid series win, like you mentioned, on the road. And it's kind of just hard to deny their overall record at this point. And yeah, just another one of those teams. Solid start, just needs those quality wins. And as they continue to get those, they'll continue to climb up.
And then I think here is when the rankings gets relatively difficult. There's still a few teams that did well and were already ranked previously, but I think this is where you can bring in other teams that weren't ranked, or where teams that played really bad this past week could potentially drop to, if not further down. But for me personally, in this 18 spot, I brought in Iowa, who's 16-3 overall. They haven't faced the toughest schedule and recently, but they keep getting wins, and I think at this point they deserve to be ranked. And you can't look past that they beat LSU earlier in the season, so they have got a few quality wins under their belt.
Yeah, Iowa is a team that I was considering for my top 25, but unfortunately they did not make it in, and not in the 18th spot either. Here at this spot is where I moved up Santa Barbara. Um, just an okay week from them, series win, but so many teams in front of them played bad that I slotted them up here in this 18th spot. And I moved up one more team up into this area, which was Florida Gulf Coast, who went 5-0 on the week. Not incredible competition, but they took care of business. And so I felt like moving these two teams up was the right move considering they were in the rankings previously and teams ahead of them were just plummeting down.
Yeah, I moved both of those teams up a few spots as well. I just thought that, I mean, their overall resume weren't jumping off the page to me, and I think some other teams that potentially could be ranked this week could jump them in that regard, but they're definitely, yeah, in the 20-ish area for me. But at this spot, I mean, we have all these teams this past week that played bad, like Texas Tech, who got swept by Texas. We got Ole Miss, who went 1-3 and got swept as well by Florida, who obviously is a really good team, but it's not a great look when you start the conference 0-6. We also have Texas A&M, who has 5 losses in the conference, and they've obviously faced really tough competition in the first 2 weeks, and they're gonna face really good series next week. But getting one win from 2 series isn't great. And similarly, Missouri, another SEC team that didn't have a good week. They came into the rankings this past week and then dropped out, or potentially is dropping out this week with getting swept after sweeping Tennessee. So really up and down for them. And then a few other teams that probably aren't going to be ranked. For me personally, I had Miami and UCF both dropping out. This past week, we had UCF in the 25 spot. They went 1-3. That just won't do. You gotta do better than that. Even if you go 2-2 there, you're probably still dropping out. And then Miami with 9 losses on the season so far, going 1-3 this past week and getting swept at Wake Forest. It's tough going there and getting swept, which if they got one win there, probably still ranked for me personally, but couldn't do that, and unfortunately dropping out there for me. But a lot of teams that just look like they didn't want to be ranked this week, and not many teams outside the rankings that looked like they wanted to be ranked. So really tough to kind of gauge where teams fit in here, how far they fall, if they fall completely out of the rankings, and stuff like that.
Yeah, I similarly have Miami and UCF dropping out. So I guess we can kind of try to solidify these last 8 teams that we're putting in here. I think we have some similar ones. I would be good with putting Iowa in. They were probably my 26 or 27. The reason I left them out is because I think Maryland is also fairly close to coming back in. And I think this upcoming weekend, Iowa versus Maryland, is probably for a spot in the top 25. And so I kind of just wanted to leave it at that. Uh, the two teams I brought in were Washington and Coastal Carolina. Neither have remarkable resumes up to this point, but neither of them have lost a series. Coastal Carolina does have some good midweek wins over Wake Forest and Campbell, and they just picked up another one as we're recording against North Carolina. So they do have some good midweek wins, and they haven't lost a weekend series. But I mean, these end of the rankings are just tough, and you can make an argument for multiple teams to be jumping in here.
Yeah, so we have like probably a lot of these teams that were higher in the rankings still in, but we have different teams jumping in because I have Iowa and Texas. Just Texas is on an absolute tear, 18-7 overall after starting 4-7, so they're on a 14-game win streak, and they haven't faced amazing competition, but they just swept Texas Tech, so they definitely proved that they're on the right path and could definitely be ranked this week, if not next. But yeah, it's gonna be tough to fill in these spots for sure. For me personally, I didn't really like putting Washington in for pretty much one fact and one fact only because they went 2-2 on the week, even though they won at UCLA, losing that midweek. It's happened before this year in our rankings where a midweek loss can really damage your overall week resume and drop you down or out of the rankings. But yeah, so being 2-2 is tough. If they went 3-1, I think they definitely could potentially deserve a spot there. But 2-2 is just it's tough to put a team in after going 500.
I agree with that, and they were my 25 spot. They were the last one I was putting in. But yeah, it's tough, like you said, with a 2-2 week. But a lot of these other teams also have some tough spots on the resume. Texas, like you mentioned, was another team I was considering, and it was a similar case to the Iowa Maryland statement that I made earlier, where Texas plays Oklahoma State this upcoming weekend, which I think is a huge prove it series for them. Yes, they are hot. They haven't played the greatest competition over this stretch. And so I think this series against Oklahoma State is very big, and it'll really solidify if they're back on that like type of level that we thought they may be earlier in the year.
Yeah, I think that's fair. It's tough because I mean I'm not opposed to adding more teams in. Like if we add Texas, we could also add I don't know somebody else that you have, not Washington, but but yeah, I think there's definitely openings. It's just tough to figure out which teams deserve to drop out and which teams don't because from my opinion all of them do, but there's just not enough spots, right? If Missouri were to drop out, I think Texas A&M should also be gone. Ole Miss is kind of in that same boat. I think maybe Texas Tech has a little bit more leeway, but not much. I don't know. It's pretty brutal in this area with so many SEC teams just on the fringe.
Yeah, the order for me out of those teams, from top to bottom, was Texas Tech, Missouri, A&M, Ole Miss, and I am completely fine with dropping out Ole Miss, especially with their 0-6 mark in SEC play at this point. They've played two very tough teams, so it's not like it's a end all be all that their season's over or anything. But you would like to see at least one win over those 2 weekends from them. It's just not a good start at all, and it's not a good look on the overall resume.
Yeah, and maybe this will light a fire under the team if we drop them out of the rankings like we saw last year. I mean, they have it in them to turn this season around, and they definitely can. But it's just not the best start. But they can definitely just get hot at any time. So yeah, I think that's reasonable to drop Ole Miss. So you only brought two teams in as well, with Washington being one of them.
Yeah, and
Which
I'm fine with Washington not going in.
okay,
So
so if we bring in Iowa and Texas from my side at somewhere in the rankings, then we can drop Ole Miss, I guess, and that's fine with me.
yep,
But yeah,
yeah,
now we
I
just
like
have to
that.
figure out the order of everything. So yeah, I guess we can bring Florida Gulf Coast and UCSB up, even though I had Iowa and Texas above them. I think that's fine. I had Florida Gulf Coast above UCSB this past week, just because they had a little bit better of a week and their record is a little bit better, and they've played some pretty good competition over the season so far, and yeah, they've kind of just been slowly proving it. So I think maybe Florida Gulf Coast in that 18 spot and then UCSB, but not too sold on it.
Yeah, I think you can flip flop those either way. It doesn't really matter a whole lot. I think they're in a similar boat there. Like I said, with like UCSB, there's 2 in 1 week over Cal State Northridge. It's just not that impressive. So yeah, I'm fine with moving Florida Gulf Coast up here if you'd like.
Sweet. Yeah, that works. And then from there, I think we can probably put in the new additions just because I don't think any of these teams the past week that were ranked and had bad weeks really deserve to be ranked. So I think the ones that we added in maybe have a little bit more leeway there. But then it's just figuring out that order. For me personally, I had Iowa above Texas. So where do you think you want to like put things in there?
Yeah, I'd be fine with putting Iowa here, especially with just that headliner win against LSU. So
Yep.
they have
Sweet.
the overall record, have that win. I'm good with them here.
And then for the 21 spot, what are you thinking?
Yeah, it could go either way here. I mean, I personally liked Coastal Carolina,
Sure.
just because they've taken care of business up to this point in all their series, and they do have impressive midweek wins. They're starting to really rack those up. So I like how they're looking so far.
Yeah, it's interesting. They have like a lot of good wins, but somehow they have like what, 7 losses, which is like not great record, just overall, which is very interesting. It's like I don't understand how they have this many losses. It's just like looking at their like season to this point, it just doesn't seem like that. And then you look at their overall record, and there they are with 7 losses. So they're like in that same boat as Texas. So I mean, I don't really care personally. I think it doesn't matter that much with big series coming up for Texas once again. So I think we can put a Coastal in that 21 spot, but obviously I think Texas should probably be above Texas Tech, just because of the head to head this past week. But
Yeah,
after that, it's yeah, filling in the last few losers that somehow stayed in.
yeah. I would say we go Coastal and then Texas. With
Sweet.
Texas, they're playing Oklahoma State this upcoming weekend. So if they win that series, they're probably jumping Coastal regardless, because it's tougher competition than Coastal's going to be playing. And like you
Yeah,
said, they need to be ahead of Texas Tech as well.
definitely. And then the last 3 spots we have Texas Tech, Texas A&M, and Missouri. It's tough to order these teams. Like we mentioned, I think we had Texas Tech as the next team there, so we can just put them in at 23, which I think doesn't really show the gap between Texas Tech and Texas this past week, but I guess it is what it is. With Texas just absolutely dominating them there, but yeah, we have 2 more spots to fill up. I don't know. It's tough because Missouri did get swept on the weekend, and Texas A&M also did get swept by Tennessee. So it's tough. You look at their SEC record, and obviously Missouri stands out with sweeping Tennessee the previous week. So you look at that like similar games, you could say like Missouri probably deserves to be above Texas A&M at this spot, but yeah, it's
Yeah, I had Missouri above them, just for that exact reason, was them having swept Tennessee the week before. Just better overall record in SEC play, and the common opponents here with A&M. A&M just got swept by Tennessee, so not that that necessarily translates super well, but I think it just makes it easy for this ranking.
yeah, sweet. That works for the following spots. Awesome. So, this is the week 6 college baseball rankings rundown. Starting at 25, Texas A&M, Missouri, Texas Tech, Texas, Coastal Carolina, Iowa at 20, UCSB, Florida Gulf Coast, Kentucky, Campbell, Boston College at 15, Oklahoma State, UNC, East Carolina, UCLA, South Carolina at 10, Tennessee at 9, Louisville at 8, Stanford 7, Arkansas 6, Virginia 5, Florida 4, Vanderbilt 3, Wake Forest 2, and LSU in that number 1 spot.